Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Smith, and I'm the coordinator of the Toronto Mensa monthly webinar series, Inquiring Minds. And I warmly welcome you to this edition of the series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Labos is a cardiologist with a degree in epidemiology. So you may ask, what is epidemiology? You don't have to memorize this. Epidemiology is the study of the determinants, the occurrence, and the distribution of health and disease in a defined population. Dr. Labos might elaborate on that as we go, we'll see. Dr. Labos is affiliated with McGill University and is heavily involved in scientific research and teaching. And he has developed a series of podcasts known as The Body of Evidence. Recent topics on the podcast include microplastics, long COVID, sports and fitness, and the drug Ozempic when used to treat diabetes, but alternatively obesity. Dr. Labos writes articles for the Montreal Gazette, and he has a regular broadcast on the Montreal radio station, CJAD. He has been interviewed on the CBC, and as well, he's a regular health columnist for the CBC series, Wellness. Moreover, he has written a book.
There it is.
Yay. Does Coffee Cause Cancer? Which I have been reading, and it is very readable, very interesting, very easy to read. I guess I should say, I recommend it.
There you go.
Now, somehow, Dr. Labos also finds some time to practice as a cardiologist at the McGill University Cardiovascular Prevention Center. So we're very grateful he was able to find the time to be with us this afternoon. So for the title of today's talk, Dr. Labos has chosen, Does Coffee Cause Cancer? Welcome, Dr. Christopher Labos. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. There are some names in the chat that I actually recognize. I don't think we've ever actually met in person, but there are names I recognize. So hello again to some of you, and hello to the first time for some of you. All right, I am going to start my presentation, and I will share my screen, and we will get this show on the road. All right, and play. And there we go. Let me just get the bar out of the way. All right, so the title of this talk is Does Coffee Cause Cancer? Because that's the title of the book. Now, I'm drinking coffee now, so you can maybe take a guess as to whether I think it actually causes cancer or not. But if you want to know the answer, you have to stay until the end of the presentation. But really, what this talk is about is the things that I've learned in both my academic training and also things I've picked up from a somewhat accidental career in medical journalism. And if people are interested in the end, I can tell you how I sort of got involved in all of this. Before we get started, I should say that I have no disclosures. I have no conflicts of interest. I don't take money from the pharmaceutical industry or from private sources, really. And that's because if you're going to be giving talks to the public and informing the public about issues like this, I think it is important to be able to say that, you don't have conflicts of interest. And so that's why I do that. You could, and the reason I do this is because health headlines are confusing. Now, you could be forgiven if you thought that this was how people generate the news headlines about food. You spin 3 wheels, you find out that coffee can cause depression in twins, or that smoking causes hypothermia in children. And you could be forgiven for thinking that because at some point, everything has been shown to both cause and prevent cancer. Every food has at some point been shown to be both protective and harmful when it comes to cancer and many other medical conditions. And so if you're a member of the general public and you're, sitting around and, scrolling through Twitter, or X as it's now called, it's understandable that you would be confused by the fact that coffee seems to both help you live longer and potentially cause cancer. You would be potentially very, very confused about whether fish oils are good or bad for your heart. And you would be thoroughly perplexed about whether it should be a low carb, high fat, or a low fat, high carb diet that's better for your health. And so that's what I try to do, is I try to fact check the internet, which, as you can imagine, is somewhat exhausting because there's a lot of issues when it comes to communicating medical science. Now, there are issues with fraud, right? When people just deliberately produce fake results, but that's not what this talk is about. There are challenges in translating basic science to the bedside, but that's not what this talk is about. And of course, there are limitations in translating animal research into humans, because what is toxic in animals may not be toxic to humans, and what's toxic to humans may not be toxic to animals, right? But that's not what this talk is about either. This talk is about the errors in logic that we make that cause us to misinterpret the medical research. And that's because when we see studies, what we see are associations, right? When you see a study published, it says that X is associated with Y. But our brain interprets that to mean X causes Y. And that's what we assume. But that's not necessarily true, because correlation does not equal causation. And if you speak to anybody who does science communication, you will often hear this term. It's sort of almost a battle cry, if you will. Correlation isn't causation. And that's because two things can go together, and yet one doesn't cause the other. Because there's a very, very tight correlation between the age of Miss America and the number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects that occur every year. There's actually a very strong correlation between US spending on science, space, and technology and the number of suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. And as most people who study science know, there is a very, very tight correlation between the number of people who drown by falling into a pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in any given year. All of these things are true. This is not fake data. This is real data. These are very real and very strong correlations. But I hope you would agree with me that one does not cause the other. Because just because two things go together doesn't mean that they were necessarily causal. And you might say, okay, well, these are just laughable examples. These are jokes that you got off the internet. And, all those slides were from a website, tylervision.com, that you can go to and that you can explore if you like. And you might say, okay, well, but this doesn't really happen in medicine. These are obviously jokes. And yet there was a time not that long ago when people thought that ice cream caused polio. And that was because polio cases would peak in the summer and ice cream sales would peak in the summer. And so people would look at this and say, well, maybe ice cream caused polio. Now, of course, eventually it became very, very clear that polio was caused by a virus, and we now have a vaccine against polio. And yet you can understand why people would look at this and say, maybe there's a correlation there. Maybe one has caused the other. Now you're going to say, okay, but we haven't believed this for decades now. Now we obviously understand we're not going to make the same types of mistakes now that we made back in the 1940s. And yet, while searching for this slide to make this point in the presentation, you'll find slides like this from papers trying to make the case that no, it's not it's not the vaccine that caused the decrease in polio. It was the fact that we stopped using pesticides. It's pesticides that are responsible to polio. They're not. Obviously, we know that now. We have a vaccine against polio. And yet, mathematically speaking, there is no distinction between this association and this association. It's just two things that happen to go together by random chance. Because at the same time that we rolled out a polio vaccine, we also stopped using yet less pesticides for a variety of reasons. And so this is actually what this talk is about. after that very, very long introduction, my hope today is to show you that when you read a study, what you're seeing is that X is associated with Y, but that in reality, there are 5 potential possible explanations. That X causes Y, that Y causes X, that this is all just due to random chance, that this could be due to bias, or that this could be due to confounding. And I'm going to try to explain what all of those things actually means. So let's begin with reverse causation. We assume when we read a study that X causes Y, and yet mathematically, there is no reason why Y couldn't cause X. Mathematically, to the computer that's doing the statistical analysis, these mean the same thing. We, of course, excuse me, we, of course, know that cause must precede effect, right? We know that smoking causes lung cancer. Lung cancer doesn't make you smoke more. So if you see an association between smoking and lung cancer, you can be pretty certain that it's the smoking that is the causative agent that led to the disease state. That being said, though, there were very many prominent people that actually thought the second point. They actually did not believe that smoking was harmful. They thought that lung cancer made you smoke more. And one of the biggest names in this, Ronald Fisher, the individual who invented the p-value that I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second, really believed this for a very, very long period of time. So these are mistakes even very intelligent people make. And sometimes, because sometimes it's not really so obvious. And one of the best examples I can give you is about red wine and heart disease. When you look at the association between red wine and heart disease, it is often portrayed as a U-shaped association like this. Excuse me. It is often portrayed as a U-shaped association where the risk is highest if you drink 0. It decreases down to a sweet spot when you drink a little bit and then starts to go up again once you overdo it. And this is very, very common. Many people come up to me and talk about the benefits of red wine, even though I specifically asked them not to. And you would be surprised how many times people have come up to me in the clinic and said, you know, doctor, I really try to drink 2 glasses of red wine a day. I just don't really like drinking wine. And it's really hard for me to fit that in. And I have to say to them, please, for the love of God, if you don't want to drink red wine, don't drink red wine. It's really not necessary. It's not good for your heart. And that's because there's something called the sick quitter effect. It's formerly also known as protopathic bias. And that comes from the fact that most people drink some alcohol, okay? So very few people drink 0, right? Now, some people don't drink alcohol for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, for medical reasons, what have you. But the majority of the people that you're going to survey, if you're doing a medical study, probably did drink at some point in their life, and they've now quit drinking. And there is a difference between people who never drank and people who used to drink and then quit, okay? Because once I uncover the last part of this graphic, which I took from this paper that I referenced earlier, you can see that there's a big difference between former drinkers and never drinkers. Never drinkers are at more or less the same risk level as everybody else. There is some degree of variation. But the big peak here is in people who used to drink alcohol and quit. That's why it's called the sick quitter effect, because they were probably told at some point, because they developed high blood pressure or heart disease or maybe cancer or diabetes, that they should cut back on alcohol because alcohol is really not that good for you. It's loaded with sugar, it increases your blood pressure, and it's actually quite toxic to heart muscle when you take it in high doses. So a lot of these people who quit drinking, who are former drinkers, probably quit because they are at higher risk to begin with. And so what happens when you talk about the sick quitter effect, it's not that abstinence leads to disease. It's that the disease leads to abstinence, right? People who get sick stop drinking. That's why drinking looks as if it's protective when it actually isn't. All this to say, alcohol is really not good for you. It is a clear carcinogen. It causes birth defects. It makes you fat. I mean, there's a reason we call it beer belly, not celery belly, right? It's very loaded with calories. And the antioxidants in alcohol do nothing. So, you know, if I told you this about any other food, you wouldn't drink it. So all this to say is like, if you want to drink alcohol, you can drink alcohol. What you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to think that it's health food, because it really, really isn't. Okay, so that's the first thing that can throw you off when you're analyzing data. You can mix up cause and effect. You can experience reverse causation. But let's assume there is no reverse causation. Could this all be due to random chance? And the reality is people underestimate how much random chance affects medical research. This association between people drowning in a pool and Nicolas Cage films is completely random, right? This is a completely random association. I think all of us can agree on that. And yet, although we can look at this and understand that it's random, we have a really hard time identifying that in other situations. And one of the best example is to look at something called the ISIS-2 trial, which was published in The Lancet in 1988. And this was an important study because, first of all, it was the first time that we showed that taking an aspirin when you're having a heart attack was decreased the risk of a cardiovascular complication after that heart attack. So impressive to think that prior to 1988, we didn't actually give aspirin to people who were having a heart attack. It's a relatively recent innovation in the field of cardiology. But despite all of that, the ISIS-2 trial is significant for one very important reason. There was one subgroup of people who did not benefit when they took aspirin. And this is the point where I'm going to ask you, if you know the answer, if you know who that subgroup is, either because you know this or because you've heard me speak before, but if you know who this subgroup is, scream it out. Scream it out to the group. You will seem extremely intelligent to everybody listed here. And I will take a sip on the off chance that nobody knows the answer to this question. But there was one subgroup of people who did not benefit. And that subgroup of people is, of course, Geminis and Libras. When the researchers analyzed the data of the ISIS-2 study, they found that Geminis and Libras did not experience the same degree of benefit. In fact, they had a slight increase, but it was not statistically significant. Now, this was done on purpose because the authors of the study said all of these subgroup analyses should be taken less as evidence about who benefits than as evidence that such analyses are potentially misleading. Okay? Because what they did in their research was they looked at all these different subgroups. Astrological sign first to prove a point, but then also, did these people have a heart attack in the past? Were they diabetic? Were they male or female? What was their age? What was their blood pressure? What was their heart rate? Did they have aspirin in the past? So they looked at a number of different variables. And of course, if you look at a number of different variables, sometimes you're going to see associations come up as positive simply because of the play of chance. And this is because of a phenomenon in statistics called multiple hypothesis testing. Now, without boring you too much with the statistics of how we run clinical trials or just do research in general, at the outset, a priori, you always set something called the type 1 error rate, which loosely speaking means the probability that you will claim that there's a difference between two therapies when none exists. And by convention, in science, we set the type 1 error rate at 5%, which is sort of where we get the 95% confidence interval when you see studies. Like if you've ever seen a poll around election time, they'll be like, oh, this study is accurate to within 2 to 3 percentage points 19 times out of 20. Well, that's where this 19 times out of 20 things comes from, because the false positive rate is set a priori to 5%. You may disagree with that number. You may think that that's unreasonably high and it should be set lower, but this is the convention that we are sort of stuck with, and changing it now would be very, very difficult. But that assumes that you're doing one test, right? If you do one statistical analysis, your chance of a false positive will be 5%. If you do two tests, the chance that at least one of them will be a false positive goes up to 9.75%. Do 5 tests, it's over 22%. Do 10 tests, it's over 40%. And so this is the problem that we get to, is that if you do enough analyses, you will get an incorrect result. I wrote a paper for the blog Science-Based Medicine about cell phones and cancer. For people who remember this study, this was a few years back, the National Toxicology Program did a study where they exposed rats and mice to cell phone signals to see if they caused cancer. And this was a significant study for a number of reasons. That was the day that I learned that rats and mice were not, in fact, the same animal. But it was also significant and made a lot of news headlines because they saw this signal for cardiac schwannomas, causing is a specific type of tumor that they were observing in rats. Now, what was interesting about this is that they saw schwannomas in the heart. They didn't see a signal for schwannomas overall. Overall, there was no difference. And they saw a signal as well for malignant gliomas, but only with one specific type of cell phone signal. But what they failed to sort of highlight in the analysis and in the communication of this paper was they investigated dozens of types of cancer. Right? They looked at liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, stomach cancer, cardiac cancers, gliomas in the brain, kidney cancer, pituitary cancer, and looked at them in male mice and female mice, in male rats and female rats. And they only saw the signal in male rats, not in the other animals, only for those specific types of cancer that I told you, and only with the gliomas for a specific type of cell phone signal. So looking at this, I would be inclined to say, well, this is a mostly negative study. Of course, you would expect to see some positive signals simply because of multiple hypothesis testing. But that wasn't a point that was always made clear, especially in talking to the public, because do enough tests, you will get a positive signal. That's just a given. Multiple hypothesis testing has sometimes been referred to as p-hacking, but it's this idea that you do enough statistical tests until you get a statistically significant result, which in science, in medicine, in research is usually a p-value less than 0.05. The p-value, this p statistic, is a statistical test that we use to try to determine if something is due to the play of chance or whether it's a true finding. It's actually a little bit more nuanced than that, and the true definition of a p-value is very, very counterintuitive, but I'm going to spare you the details now. All you need to know is that the p-value is a test, and if you do enough statistical analyses, eventually one of them will come back positive, and you will be able to publish your results. And the reason why this is problematic is because of the case of Brian Wansink. You may not know who Brian Wansink is, but you've almost certainly heard of his work. He was the director of the Cornell Food Lab, and he wrote this blog post called The Student Who Never Said No. And you can still find it online as part of the Wayback Machine on the internet. And the basic premise of the paper was he had this grad student, and she was analyzing data, and she didn't find any statistically significant results. And he said to her, you go back and you keep analyzing the data until you find something. And wouldn't you know what, eventually she found something, and we published the paper, and we all lived happily ever after. And so he writes this blog post, and people, said to him, start commenting, they're like, Brian, you realize that what you just described is p-hacking. I mean, if you go through your data set, you will eventually find something, right? This is not how research is supposed to work. And long story short, they went through all of his previous research, and it turned out, no, he was not actually doing his research properly. And a lot of his studies had to be retracted. And you've probably heard of these studies, this idea that if you have smaller plates, you won't eat as much and you'll lose weight because we're conditioned to only eat the food that's in front of us. We're conditioned to finish our plates, right? That was him. He did an experiment called the bottomless soup bowl, where he would pipe soup back into people's soup bowls and they just kept eating. Turns out, no, he just kind of like didn't reanalyze the data properly. He did a study where he looked at successive iterations of a cookbook over 50 years. I think it was The Joy of Cooking. And he looked at it and said, oh, portion sizes have gone up over the decades. Well, in reality, no, they haven't. In fact, in most cases, they've stayed stable. So he informed a lot of food research and food policy. The reasons why fruit for a while had like stickers of like Sesame Street characters, that was because of his research. It turns out, no, it really doesn't make a difference. It doesn't encourage kids to eat more fruit. So we were spending money and time and effort based on stuff that he had did, even though it actually really wasn't useful or even true. And so this is the problem, is that you can publish anything in a scientific paper if you're willing to ignore all the negative studies that come with research, right? If all you're going to do is highlight the positive stuff and ignore the negative stuff, you're going to have a very, very skewed representation of what the scientific evidence actually says. And a practical example of this is what happened with antidepressants. Eric Turner published this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he was working at the FDA at the time. He noticed that a lot of the studies being submitted to the FDA that did not show a benefit to antidepressants were not getting published in the scientific literature. They were being submitted to the FDA, but they weren't being made available to the general public to be published in medical journals. And so he did an analysis of how likely was it that a paper would get published, depending on whether it was positive, so in accordance with the FDA decision, or whether it was negative in discordance with the FDA decision. It turns out that if you were a negative paper on antidepressants, you were much less likely to get published. And there's a name for this. It's called publication bias. Now, that's not the point to say that I'm not trying to claim that antidepressants don't work. They do work. They are actually very effective medications, but they have to be used properly in the right patient population. And I think the point that's being made here is that if you want people to have a nuanced and fundamental understanding of how medications work, you cannot make a certain amount of the evidence inaccessible. Because if we're not certain that stuff is true, we can't make good decisions. Now, there's an obvious way to guard against these types of just random associations. It's to do a replication, right? Do the study again. If you get the same result twice, then it's very likely to be true. Now, the problem with replication is that you don't see it very often. You don't see it in magic shows. You don't see it in scientific studies. And there's a few reasons for that. One is replication is not considered to be very, very sexy. There's no incentive for people to try to replicate other people's work. And that leads to a very, very serious problem, which is that a lot of the studies that get published don't end up being replicated. Truly, they either end up just not being tried again, they either end up contradicting themselves, or they get a benefit that is less significant than what was previously thought. And, this is why we get into situations like this. I wrote a paper for Maclean's way, way back now about study 329. And this was a famous study on antidepressants that showed a risk for increased suicidality when they were given to young people. But that evidence, that signal, was suppressed by the pharmaceutical company that sponsored the trial for a very, very long period of time. And so almost more important than the paper itself is the fight that went on to get it released and available to researchers who could then analyze it properly and show that that risk does exist. Okay, so if we made data more open and more accessible to researchers, that would obviously help, but we have to actually do it. Now, that was random chance, right? There's another problem that we have to think about when we analyze data, and that is the concept of bias. Because even, again, random chance is a big problem, but that assumes that there's no bias and no confounding in our research. And there's always bias. Now, there's actually 74 different types of bias. We're not going to go through them all, obviously, but we're going to break them down into two basic categories: selection bias and information bias. Selection bias is how we select patients. Information bias is how we collect data. The best example of selection bias is this study, which ended up becoming the title for the book. This was a study about coffee and pancreatic cancer. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1981. And what researchers found was they found that drinking coffee tripled your risk of developing pancreatic cancer. And as you can imagine, at the time, this caused a lot of a stir because it was a very significant and very worrisome finding. There was a lot of media attention that was paid to this at the time. What the researchers did was they went to local Boston and Rhode Island hospitals and they recruited pancreatic cancer patients. And they picked their controls from the same hospital. So they got patients with pancreatic cancer and they took other patients that didn't have pancreatic cancer that were there in hospital for something else. And they gave them questionnaires about what they ate and what they drank. And they were initially interested in looking at smoking and alcohol. But then they also asked them about other stuff, and they asked them about cancer, and that was one of the things that came out in the questionnaire. And they said, "Whoa, this is pretty interesting and actually kind of worrisome." But what they forgot was the patients who didn't have pancreatic cancer were obviously sick because they were in hospital. And at the time, late 70s, early 80s, one of the main reasons why you would be in hospital for a gastric issue was because you had stomach ulcers. And back then, in the era before medication, one of the ways that we used to treat stomach ulcers was surgery. People used to have parts of their stomach removed, a partial gastrectomy. And so a lot of these patients had had gastric ulcers, they had stomach surgery, they were recovering from hospital. And so if you think about it, people with ulcers tend not to drink a lot of coffee. right? Because it irritates the stomach and they have pre-existing stomach issues to begin with. So what happened was you created this association where you had two diseases linked by the fact that both patients were hospitalized. You ended up creating a link between the exposure, which is coffee, and the two diseases, not because there was an actual link between them, but because you were only looking at hospitalized patients. And there's a specific name for this bias. It's called Bergson's bias. So because you picked pancreatic cancer patients from the hospital, because the controls also had gastrointestinal issues and were more likely to have gastric ulcers, and because people with ulcers don't drink coffee, when you compared the pancreatic cancer patients with the gastric ulcer patients, it made it seem as if there was a differential in how they drank coffee. But if you had compared the two in terms of, if you had compared the pancreatic cancer patients to the general population, you would have seen that there was no difference in coffee consumption between the groups. Who you compare your patients to makes a big difference. And if you pick the wrong group, you develop something called selection bias, which is what makes it seem as if coffee can cause cancer. The other form of bias that I mentioned to you is something called information bias. And information bias happens when we measure data incorrectly. Now, if you're going to use questionnaires, you're going to have a problem because people underreport smoking on questionnaires. If you ask people if they smoke, they tend to say no, even if they do. They overreport their height, they underreport their weight, and they do this in such predictable ways that there are actually correction factors that have been published that you can use to adjust for self-reported height and weight in both men and women. Of course, you could just measure it yourself, but sometimes you don't have that capacity, and you end up asking people on questionnaires. And this you could say, okay, maybe it doesn't make a huge difference, a pound more or less, given that most people round their height and weight anyways, maybe it won't make that big of a difference, which is fair. But it becomes a problem when you start looking at food questionnaires, because food questionnaires are very, very inaccurate. And because of this inaccuracy, there is this prevailing feeling out there that a lot of food research is not helpful and actually meaningless because, people can't really remember what they ate for dinner 6 months ago. Asking people to average out their food consumption is not completely fair. I mean, this is what a food questionnaire will potentially look like, and this is what they ask you. You have to do this for every single food. So these are the instructions. Please try to average your seasonal use of foods over the entire year. For example, if a food such as cantaloupe is eaten 4 times a week during the approximate 3 months that it is in season, then the average use would be once per week. If you genuinely believe that people are sitting down and doing this type of calculation for every single one of the foods that's on the list of your food questionnaire, I hate to break it to you, but they're probably not. Especially these questionnaires are sometimes, they're like dozens of pages long. Like it takes somebody like a good hour, hour and a half to go through this. I'm not convinced that when we ask people about their food consumption, we're getting anything much more reasonable than a basic guess. Because it's hard to remember what you eat, right? And it's especially hard when you consider that most of us don't really prepare our own food anymore. If you eat out a lot, do you really know how many eggs you've eaten? There's probably eggs in your food, but you have no reliable way to measure that. You're probably just giving people a very basic guess. And if we don't acknowledge the uncertainty in that measurement, we get situations like this, where food can be both protective or harmful depending on how you look at the data and how people answer their food questionnaires. That's why we get this degree of heterogeneity in the research. And one of the best examples for this, or one of the funniest at least, is something this was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine about chocolate and whether it was linked to your ability to win a Nobel Prize. Now, what this study was, this was done by a researcher who went and essentially looked up on Wikipedia how many Nobel Prizes have been won by countries, what the average chocolate consumption is per capita of different countries, and plotted out this line. And, I think you would be impressed by how closely all the dots seem to fit on a straight line. And so his contention was, oh, maybe eating more chocolate can help you win a Nobel Prize because it boosts your brain power. Now, there's a problem with this type of analysis. And the problem with this type of analysis is very clear. Countries don't win Nobel Prizes, and countries don't eat chocolate. People win Nobel Prizes, and people eat chocolate. And you can't prove that the people who eat the chocolate are the people who then go on to win a Nobel Prize. And there's a specific name for this association or this fallacy. It's called the ecological fallacy. And it's that country level exposures do not apply to individuals. And yet we sort of do this all the time, right? France does more of this and they have less heart disease than the US. Well, that must be why they have less heart disease. But you're assuming that everybody in France drinks the wine. That was sort of where the French paradox came from. Well, the French have less heart disease and the French drink a lot of wine, ergo it's the wine that must prevent heart disease. And in fact, no, that's clearly not true. There's a lot of reasons why France is different than the US in terms of their general health status and their healthcare system and a whole bunch of factors. But these types of things are common. And I think a lot of the issues with chocolate specifically persist because people like eating chocolate and like red wine. Look, if you want to eat chocolate, you can eat chocolate. Just don't think that it's health food. And by the way, before we move on, there was a very, very large study about chocolate called the Cosmo study, which was supposed to establish definitively if there was any health benefits to chocolate, both cardiovascular or neurologic. The study was published. There was no benefit. And shockingly, we just don't talk about it anymore. And we still keep talking about, oh, there's a potential health benefit for chocolate. There really, really isn't. So that was bias, both selection bias and information bias. In those situations, we make it happen. We choose wrong. We measure badly. But confounding exists in nature. Confounding is a similar concept, but it's something that we have to overcome. And the way this works is this happens when you have a third variable that is linked to other outcomes, or linked to an exposure and an outcome. So the best way to think about that is imagine that you wanted to see if lighters cause lung cancer. And, it's true that people who carry lighters in their pockets are more likely to get lung cancer, but the people who carry lighters are more likely to smoke. So it's not that lighters cause lung cancer, it's that both of these things are more common in smokers. And so smokers carry lighters, smokers get lung cancer. It makes it seem as if lighters lead to lung cancer. Same type of things happens with vitamins and mortality. Older people tend to take more vitamins, although that's kind of changing in this day and age where vitamins are becoming something hip and chic for young people to do. But if whether you take vitamins depends on your age, well, that's going to affect mortality as well. So age will confound the association between vitamins and mortality. And, many times people thought that vitamins had beneficial effects because they were observed in observational studies. But then you do a randomized controlled trial and it turns out that no, vitamin C has nothing to do with heart disease. There's been many examples in the literature. I'm just going to skip over this part because we're getting a little bit short on time, and I do want to leave time for questions. Although I do have some very funny anecdotes and examples for later. But at the end of the day, you have to realize that unless you do a randomized trial, you're not going to be able to fully adjust for differences between two groups. And again, randomized trials are not the be all or end all either. They sometimes do come out wrong. And there are issues with randomized trials. And one of the greatest examples was the Predimed trial that had to be republished because there were statistical problems with how they collected data. So not everything, there is no perfect trial. You have to be careful in everything you do. One final point before we move on is that you have to understand what these statistics actually mean. So if you were to do a study about whether coffee, and I'm going to take my last sip of coffee here before we get to the question and answer period. If you were to do a study showing that coffee increased the risks of heart attack, which this one did, increases the risk of heart attack by 50%, you have to ask, well, what does that mean? 50% increase, but 50% above what? And so there was a very famous or very funny editorial written by Charles Poole shortly after that study came out that said, to the editor, just before taking my first sip from a cup of coffee, I read the case control study by Balin et al. And I said, I wonder what this 1.5 increased risk of myocardial infarction meant. And so he goes through the math and he says, that would mean the expectation on average of drinking 2 million cups of coffee to cause one heart attack. And of course, when you tell people a 50% increased risk of heart attack, that sounds scary. But if you tell people you need to drink 2 million cups of coffee to provoke one heart attack, that's obviously a lot more reassuring. So you have to understand what relative and absolute risks mean. We in research talk about relative risks because they are mathematically useful, but what matters to the public is probably absolute risks. And there are many different types of statistics out there, odds ratios and risk ratios. I don't think we'll have the time to get into it, but statistics is complicated. And if you don't know the difference between the two, you can sometimes draw wrong results. This was a famous study from the New England Journal of Medicine where they published a thing about differences in angiogram rates between white and black patients. This was a simulation study where they had actors reading a script and they said, oh, the black patients were less likely to be referred for cardiac catheterization, except that they use odds ratios, not hazard ratios. And then a second group came in, reanalyzed their data and said, yeah, you said that there was a 40% difference. Actually, if you use a risk ratio, which is more intuitive and meaningful for the general population, it's actually only a 7% difference, which is obviously a very, very different interpretation. A 40% difference in angiography rates is a very real problem. A 7% difference, still meaningful, but probably not the same degree of issue. So there's a lot of math here, and I love math, but I recognize that most people don't. The point is, though, if you've been listening to me talk, you probably think that I'm a contrarian who thinks that all medical research is wrong. I don't think that. We are better now than we have ever been. There have been so many victories of evidence-based medicine. We no longer give patients class 1 antiarrhythmics. We no longer give women hormone replacement therapy, which is sort of the prototypical example of how confounding can go wrong. We, for a very long time, thought that women after menopause should routinely get hormone replacement therapy to prevent heart disease. And it turns out, no, it actually doesn't really make a difference. But you have to test that hypothesis specifically to see. We we took COX-2 inhibitors off the market after the Vioxx incident. We passed anti-smoking laws. And life expectancy keeps going up. I mean, there has never been a better time to be alive. If somebody comes to you with a time machine and offers to take you back into the past, run. The past was horrible. You are healthier as a human being now than your parents or your grandparents could have ever hoped to be. The fact that we have nearly doubled our life expectancy over the past century is not something to sneer at. And so this is what I try to do. I have a podcast with my friend Jonathan. As you heard in the introduction, it's called The Body of Evidence. And at some point, I decided that I had too much free time on my hands, and I decided to write a book that explored a lot of these issues that we talked about today, except it's not really a science book. It's actually a romantic comedy. You can read the book like a narrative. It is really a love story. And I say that in the introduction, like, this isn't a diet book. It's a love story. And so if you want to hear what it's like, you can actually find a free sample of the audiobook version online if you just search for the title on YouTube. My friend Jonathan and I, on our podcast, we read one of the chapters like an old school radio play. And yeah, you can check it out if you're interested. There's going to be a few in-person book events coming up in the Ottawa area. And then I'm trying to organize stuff in the Greater Toronto area, possibly something in Niagara in the summer. So stay tuned, follow me on the social medias, and you'll find out. But that's basically the talk. And I will take questions in the time that we have left. And I'm happy to stick around as long as people have questions and we can get back to some of the anecdotes that we had to skip over because of time.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. We received one question right at the beginning of your talk.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Livingstone. He said that he had done a search on PubMed of COVID and omega-3, and there were 15 papers about prevention, hospitalization, and death.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, so long and the short of it is no, they don't work. So many people tried so many things with COVID. I mean, vitamin D was also a big one, omega-3s. It turned out it doesn't make a difference. I mean, omega-3s as a treatment have actually been studied up and down for multiple different endpoints. There is really no convincing evidence that they do anything. With omega-3s and with vitamin D, they get into these very, very tricky situations. They look at people with low vitamin D levels or low omega-3 levels or what have you, and like, oh, these people have worse outcomes. It must be the vitamin D deficiency that's making them sick. But that's actually reverse causality. If you think about it, there's a reason why these people are vitamin deficient or nutrient deficient. And it's usually because as we get older, as we get sicker, our diet changes. We don't eat as healthy. We don't eat as much. And especially when it comes to vitamin D, we don't go outside into the sunshine. So we don't have our skin exposed to vitamin D. So we don't make as much of it. Older individuals tend to be more vitamin D deficient, and that's why they did worse. Same thing with omega-3. So I think we can say pretty conclusively that taking omega-3s really, really doesn't make a difference. There is one situation in which if you were to get high dose prescription omega-3s, it could be used. There's a medication by prescription that sometimes your doctor will prescribe if you have residual cardiovascular disease with high triglycerides, but it's really not like there's no point in you going out to the pharmacy or the health food store to buy omega-3 supplements. It's probably not going to prevent or treat any disease.
Thank you. Wendy Wood. I'm Wendy Wood from the middle of nowhere, Consort, Alberta. There's a sense of humor like yours.
Yeah.
I manage the pharmacy that K.D. Lang's dad used to own. I've lived places from Victoria to Montreal. Moose Jaw is my hometown. I lived in Toronto for 17 years, 13 of which I was working at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH. How did I get from Toronto to Consort? That would take at least an hour to explain.
Well, I'm not going anywhere, so if you want to, I mean, I have an hour to kill. That's fine.
I co-wrote a book with the late, great Dr. Adrienne Einarsson. She had published more original research on psychiatric meds in pregnancy and lactation than anyone in the world. Her husband, the late, great Dr. Tom Einarsson, was a pharmacy professor who specialized in meta-analysis. It was a great fun to watch the two of them rip apart a study. They found studies that found a risk of something in pregnancy were far more likely to be published than those who found no risk, regardless of study quality. They also found that abstracts, that's the introduction at the beginning of a paper, very often did not match the study properly. Oh, I did research, so I know what you're talking about. Okay, now let me see if my arrow will work for me to scroll down any further. Discovered it. Just a moment. Okay, Wendy continues. The Einarssons also taught, oh, sorry, I am now having a technical problem. Let me open my box really big.
Well, I can read it if you prefer, Kathleen.
They also taught that statistical significance is very different than clinical significance.
Yeah, yeah.
And so on, and Wendy has a lot more.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, did you want to comment or shall I carry on?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, we can just jump to the, I mean, the last thing that she asked was antidepressants and the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. She's saying, like, you know, studies have shown that they are equivalent. So does that mean that cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't work? And the answer is no. Both antidepressants and cognitive behavioral therapy work, right? The point of the critiques I was making was not to be like Tom Cruise, right? Which is like, oh, antidepressants do nothing. No, they clearly work. But a psychiatrist professor of mine had the best, I think, analysis of the situation. Antidepressants are the only medication that are both overprescribed and underprescribed at the same time, because they are overprescribed to a lot of people that probably do not meet the definition of depression and probably shouldn't be on them. And yet there are a lot of people who suffer from depression who do not get appropriate treatment because of the stigma, because they don't have access to a family doctor for a whole bunch of reasons. So antidepressants clearly work. Cognitive behavioral therapy clearly works. In an ideal world, we would do both of those things together because they do serve complementary functions. It's just that you have to put yourself in the position of a family doctor who doesn't have access to a psychiatrist they can refer patients to. There are not enough psychiatrists in this country to deal with all the mental illness that is out there. So you have family doctors who are often forced to make the best of a bad situation. And SSRIs, antidepressants, whatever you want to say about them, are number one, safer and better than the antidepressants that existed in the past. So as the new generation of antidepressants, they are much better and much safer, and they are very effective. And so it is less labor intensive. The problem with cognitive behavioral therapy is that many people cannot get referred to a psychiatrist. If you go to a psychologist, because it's not covered by Medicare, you have to pay for it out of pocket, and that can become prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. And so you often have to make do with the best that you can under the situation. And that is why we prescribe antidepressants as much as we do. Not because they don't work or not because CBT is worse or whatever. It's just it's the reality of the healthcare system that we work in to a very large degree.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Elka Anola has a question and in context. In the 1960s, I followed Adele Davis closely and ate cow liver more than once a day. Unfortunately, at that time, the strontium-90 from atomic tests was in the grass that cows ate, and which was stored in their livers, which I was gleefully eating. I've since had skin cancer, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, and cervic cancer in that order. I've wondered if the strontium-90 in my body is related to those cancers. Strontium-90 has a half-life of 29. She meant to say more than once a week, not day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. Obviously, radioactive material should not be in our food supply. I mean, I think there's a fairly broad consensus on that. Could environmental exposure to radioactive particles make a difference? Well, it has, right? I mean, we've seen this in Japan after the dropping of the bomb of Hiroshima, the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was an increased incidence of cancers for many years, and in fact, even a generation after the fact. So yeah, I mean, it's not that nuclear power can't be used in some way, shape, or form, but we have to minimize the exposure to the public. If anyone, and just to go a little bit off topic, if anybody watched the HBO series on the Chernobyl explosion, a great show to watch, based on a book which is equally excellent to watch. So it's very interesting to see. I mean, yeah, but it's always very hard to say that your cancer was caused by this thing, because there's really no way to prove that, right? We just know that on average, exposure to radiation, whether it's, radioactive isotopes from nuclear research, or whether it's, radiation because of sun exposure causing skin cancer. I mean, we often forget that the greatest source of radiation that we are going to be exposed to in our lives on planet Earth is from the sun, the thing that causes skin cancer. And we are not great at putting on suntan lotion and protecting ourselves from the sun because we think tans are healthy. They are not. And as a dermatologist friend said to me once, have you ever seen a dermatologist with a tan? No, you haven't. They are all pale because they know how damaging the skin can be. And oh, by the way, since we're on the topic, not only does the sun cause skin cancer, it also causes wrinkles, right? Most aging of our skin that we see is photoaging as a result of damage from the sun's UV rays. So if you want to look younger, the best beauty product is not these $200 creams you're buying at the store. It's sunscreen. The best beauty product is sunscreen. That was the jingle of one of our podcast episodes. So there you go.
Okay. So this is anonymous for confidentiality reasons. Many years ago, my young teenage neighbor committed suicide. She was depressed and her doctor had prescribed antidepressant medication that she'd been taking for a few months. 2 weeks after her death, her doctor received a report mentioning that the risk for suicide was higher with teenagers using this medication.
Yeah.
From what you are saying, this was actually known before it was published. Are we now doing something to prevent this kind of publishing retention? For the regular public like myself, it weakens confidence in pharmaceutical companies and medical research in general.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue. I mean, here's the thing. The issue with study 329, and if you want to know the whole story, I mean, go look up the McLean's article. It's available online. Just, McLean's Christopher Labos study 329, and you'll find that I think it's free to read online. It's a problem, right? And it's a problem. Like, are we doing enough to change it? I think we're more aware of the problem now, and I think we are taking steps, but there is still an issue. There's this inherent conflict in research where people say, well, look, research is not free. We had to pay people to collect the data. We had to pay to analyze the blood samples. We had to pay to store the data in a database. Like, there was a material expense that went into collecting this data. Why should we give it away for free? Right? That's the argument that's made. The counter argument is like, sure, you absolutely put an initial investment, but a lot of that research money, at least nowadays, comes from government sources. So it's coming from public money. So it's not as if you paid for it out of pocket. And I think we've seen that we have a responsibility to transparency to make research more accessible so that we don't have situations like this. And this is an active area of debate about, should we be making data open access? Should we be making papers open access? Should there be transparency, not just in who owns the data, but who stores the data, who analyzed the data, how it was analyzed, and should we be checking each other's work? And as it is right now, there isn't that much going into the concept of let's check each other's work. A lot of the medical publishing industry is based on trust. I mean, believe it or not, a lot of it is based on trust. You're assuming that if somebody said, I did X, Y, Z, you're going to believe them because you don't really have a way to go and check that. Like if somebody wants to completely fabricate their research, until they get ratted out by somebody at their own university, you as an external observer in a different country don't really have a practical way to check up on them. And so the long-winded answer to that question is we're more aware of the problem. We know that we have to fix it, but there's no clear consensus yet on how we're going to go about doing it. And my hope is, when I give this talk to like students and younger people, is that if you expose a younger generation to these issues, you will get this type of generational change where when the old guard is gone and the new guard comes up, they will have known these problems existed and they will start to make the changes to get rid of some of the issues that exist in terms of not being able to access data.
Who knew that statistical research and analysis could be so sexy?
Yeah, exactly. Listen, this is I often joke that I often make the joke like, oh, everybody hates math, and that joke comes up in the book a few times as well. This is a fascinating topic, and the issues that come out of it are really fascinating. It's just that we don't teach it to people, and we need to expose people to these problems because they affect not just how we interpret medical research, but how we interpret things in our lives. If you've ever heard the stories like, all the good men are either married or off the market, and you're like, well, all the good guys are taken. That's not actually true. It's how we perceive the data, and that is actually a variant of selection bias, the same thing that we saw with coffee and cancer. So I find these types of things really fascinating to sort of play around with.
Okay, thank you. Wendy Wood comments, the big HRT study was complicated and it was misleading. HRT was used for too long and so on.
Yeah, HRT is hormone replacement therapy. So yeah, it was used for too long. Here's the thing. It wasn't an unreasonable thing to think about because we know that women's risk of heart disease goes up after menopause. And when you hit menopause, your estrogen levels fall because it's menopause. So it wasn't completely unreasonable to think that there was something protective about estrogen therapy, right? It wasn't an unreasonable thing to see. Did it take too long to do the definitive study, the Women's Health Initiative study, which was published in 2001 or 2002? I can't remember right now. Yeah, it took long. And I think that's another problem with science. It takes very long to get funding. Like during COVID, everybody's like, oh, why did the vaccines happen so quickly? That's weird. Like, no, because if you just throw money at people and say, go, do science, science can happen really quick. The problem, and what a lot of people don't realize, is so much of science is spent doing paperwork, applying for grants, answering emails, getting approval. If you can strip away all the bureaucracy, the science part is not hard. It's just that we underfund science. I mean, this is a reality. It's not something that's going to win you an election, right? So pouring more money into scientific research when you have competing demands that are more in people's faces, right? In terms of repairing roads and bridges and building new schools and pouring more money into hospitals. I mean, that stuff matters too, right? Like we can't be like hyper-focused. It's just that if we want answers to these questions, we have to see scientific research as something that is just as important, as something that has to be prioritized, because otherwise it takes us, we will get there eventually, but it would be nice if we could get there in 2 to 3 years rather than 10 to 20 years.
Thank you. So Wendy concludes with saying, come to Calgary. That's where she is.
So Wendy, I have a very good friend who lives in Calgary. I would love to see them if I had an excuse to come to Calgary, if you can find a place where I can give a talk, I would be more than happy to come and do it. It's always logistics, and because air travel and hotels are so expensive in this country, it is shocking. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. They had to fly from like Ireland to like Greece for something, and I think they've got a plane ticket for like 20 euros, right? To fly from Ireland to Greece, 20 euros. It costs me $300 to fly between Montreal and Toronto. It is insane how expensive airline travel is. But that's a story for another day. So happy to come to Calgary. Find me on the social medias, email me. If you can find something, we'll work it out. I'll slip it into my schedule. And it'd be nice for me to see a very good friend of mine that I have not seen in quite a long time.
Okay, she says, very good response for the antidepressant question, and I can't wait to read your book.
Well, thank you. Read the book and write a review. That really helps to boost it in the. We have to feed the algorithm. You got to feed the Amazon algorithm or the Goodreads algorithm.
And Jahangir Daruwala, JD,
Yeah.
Thanks for a very enlightening and also entertaining talk. Which books or research articles would you suggest to help people improve their critical thinking skills and reduce their cognitive biases for making good decisions?
Yeah, well, so mine's the first one. There's a few people out there doing sort of related but slightly different things. So Tim Caulfield, as you know, in Canada, has talked a lot about the wellness industry and the impact of celebrity care. Not so much on the science and the nitty-gritty, which is what I love, right? But he's been talking about the wellness industry and misinformation and pseudoscience and all that. So he has, a few books out there. Who else is there? There's a podcast apart from my own that I do with Jonathan. There's a podcast called Conspirituality, which is about not conspiracy theories per se, but again, this whole idea of how like misinformation tends to take hold, like why we believe the things we do. So if you're interested in the whole psychological aspect of where these ideas come from, that also helps. And honestly, I mean, this is sort of maybe it's a self-serving argument, but I do think traditional media has a role to play. If you read something on the CBC or the CTV or the global websites or on the news, that's probably true, despite the like a lot of hatred that journalists are getting these days. They actually put effort into the study. Now, you may like disagree with it. You may be like, oh, they missed this nuance or that nuance. But overall, they are going to give you good information that you need to know. It's like I'm going to be talking with the CBC later about the rising number of syphilis cases in this country, right? So like they are reporting on important issues, and you will not be aware of them unless you do it. So traditional media still has a role to play because they have the resources to do the type of in-depth reporting that a lot of us don't. So that's sort of where I would start with. The problem is that a lot of these concepts are very mathematical and very nuanced. Like sometimes people are like, where can I go to read? Like, what's the website where all the like research is kept? And I'm like, there's no one place. It's all over. And like being able to sort of read a paper, a scientific paper beginning to end takes training. And in fact, not even all doctors are good at it. Like doctors are trained to be clinicians. Not all of them are trained to be researchers and to do critical analysis. It is a skill set. Now, if you want to learn, follow along with me and we'll teach you stuff on the way. Read the book. You will actually get a very gentle introduction to a lot of these concepts. And then if you want to go into deeper, then you can start reading more academic stuff to get into it. But I think that's why the book is fun. It's a very gentle introduction, which then points you to the references that you can use to read up in more detail. Because you can just read it as a narrative and enjoy like, a kind of funny love story that's kind of light and easy to read. And, you can get through. People have told me they've read the book in a day. Like it's a very quick, easy read. And I did that on purpose, right? So if you're expecting War and Peace, it's not that. If you want a quick, easy read, you'll get it. And you'll have taken away a sort of an idea. It's like, oh, these are the issues I need to think about when I'm trying to do critical analysis of papers. Let me now look in the appendix, look up these references, and now I can start digging into it. And that will lead you to sort of the more academic stuff if you're interested.
Thank you. Okay, Gary and Kathy Kurt had to go, but they said great seminar. Bob Burton says China came out in favor of being vegan. Can you comment on this study or the conclusion?
Okay, so listen, there's a whole chapter in the book about red meat, right? If your question is, does eating red meat increase my risk of cancer? The answer is yes. But the important caveat is that the strength of the association is strongest with processed red meat. So hot dogs, smoked meat, stuff where you've taken the meat and processed it in some way to produce a different product, ham, bologna, stuff like that. A steak that you're just cooking on the barbecue, pure cooking, that's not processed red meat. So the association has not been as strong with that. And if you eat red meat every day, you are increasing your risk of colorectal cancer from a baseline risk of like 5% to maybe 6%. Now, if you look at that and say, well, that's a 1% risk of cancer I don't need, I'm just going to stop eating meat. I don't need to eat meat. That's fine. If you look at that number and say, well, I enjoy eating meat so much, it's so much a part of who I am in my culture, I'm willing to tolerate that 1% increased risk because I know that I live in a country like Canada where I have access to colorectal cancer screening, and I know that if I get cancer, it's going to get caught early and I'm going to be treated. That's fine too. The point is not to tell people what to do. And the reason why I didn't talk about the book itself all that much, which maybe was counterproductive and not great from marketing perspectives, but the book is written like a romantic comedy because you have characters in there having these conversations. And what I liked about the book is that I could have two characters named Jim and Katie have an argument about whether you should become a vegan or a vegetarian. And people can approach it from different perspectives. And the threshold that people are going to use to make that shift in the lifestyle is going to be different for people. And there's all these aspects about the environmental aspects, the ethical aspects of animals. And so what I liked about it was that at the end of the chapter, you don't get the final word from me. This is what you should do. In fact, I never tell you what to do in this book, right? No, the narrator, which I guess is a stand-in for me, doesn't actually tell you what to do. It just shows you the information without the fluff and the spin so you can make a conscious decision. So you can drink red wine. You can eat junk food if you want to. You can eat chocolate. You can eat red meat, but you can't pretend like this stuff is good for you. You have to understand the risk that you are taking upon yourself with the understanding that none of us are perfect, right? We are all flawed human beings and we all do things that are bad for us. I live a largely sedentary lifestyle because I'm sitting at a desk for most of the day, which is not great. It would be better for me if I was like my grandfather out there tilling the fields and working on a farm. But that's not the life I have right now. So I have made conscious decisions about my life that are maybe not the best for me. And yet I do that cognizant of the risks. And I try to mitigate those risks as much as I can. So is red meat bad for you? Yeah, a little bit. If you want to make the change, you will. If you could switch some of your red meat consumption to become fish, yeah, you would be healthier. And here's a fun trivia question. Does anybody know the medical definition between red meat and white meat? Anybody going to suggest an answer? So people will often say that pork is white meat and all that. That's not true. That's a marketing slogan. The scientific definition of red meat versus white meat, red meat is a mammal, white meat is a bird, right? So a pig, a cow, a sheep, whatever, that's going to be red meat. Chicken, duck, all of those are going to be white meat. So that's the medical scientific distinction between red meat and white meat. So, and fish is a completely different category all its own. So yeah, try to eat less red meat. I've tried to give you the mathematical explanation so you can make the decision on your own about whether there is enough risk there for you to want to make a change in behavior.
Thank you. Wendy Wood, HRT, that's hormone replacement.
Yeah.
Definitely is not protective, but used properly can help symptoms for a limited number of years. Unfortunately, the pendulum swung too far to be scared of HRT.
Right. So again, HRT went from give it to everybody to give it to no one, forgetting that its main purpose is not cardiovascular disease prevention or cancer prevention. The main purpose of HRT hormone replacement therapy is to treat menopausal symptoms. So if you're going through menopause and you have symptoms that are debilitating and bothersome to you, taking hormone replacement therapy for a short period of time, like 1 or 2 years, as you get over the menopausal symptoms, is perfectly fine and perfectly reasonable, as long as you don't have a family history of cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, something like that, okay? I think people have falsely dichotomized as like, oh, we went from good to bad. No, it's a specific treatment for hormone replacement therapy. It's just not going to do anything else. When you looked at the graphs and the slides of hormone replacement therapy, the benefit of hot flashes and dryness and all the other menopausal symptoms was huge. And you would, have a slight cardiovascular risk, a slight decrease in osteoporosis, like such small changes for everything else that it doesn't really make a huge difference. You're just putting people at a slightly increased risk for no reason. So if you have menopausal symptoms, you can totally take HRT. And in fact, you can take topical hormone replacement therapy if your symptoms are primarily like issues like vaginal dryness or something like that. You don't need to have systemic therapy. You can just have topical therapy.
Thank you. Kim Johnson, is genomic research in combination with biobanking likely to make the problem of statistical flaws, misleading conclusions in medical research even worse? Large data sets with lots of cheap computing power, does that equal many correlations?
It has the potential to be problematic. The one good thing that's happened in the field of genetics is that because these problems were coming up, like somebody would like analyze their biobank of data and like, oh, this genetic variant is important. And then somebody else would do a different analysis in their patient population and they would find a different variant. So you had hundreds of genetic variants being discovered, but nobody was discovering the same things. So it's become standard now in genetic research, at least, to have multiple data sets and that you have to replicate your results in multiple different data sets. So they have evolved to address some of these issues that we've talked about. So genetic research has gotten better than what it was 20 years ago. The real issue now with genetics is going to be, do you have enough data to accommodate the diversity of the human population? You do an analysis in, Europeans or people in North America who have European ancestry. And you're like, well, does that really apply to people who are of Asian ancestry? Does that really apply to people who are from Africa originally, from their, who have African ancestry? Genetic research is hard. Like you can obviously we're making genetic diagnoses, meaning you have this gene and you have this disease. So think of like, sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis or thalassemia, right? That exists. But this idea of doing large-scale genomic sequencing, looking for variants to identify the high-risk people with heart disease and cancer, that's coming. It's not quite there yet because it's the accuracy of the genetic models still leaves a little to be desired.
Okay, so that person who asked the question is saying that's reassuring. Thank you. Wendy, Wood, and JD are both saying thanks so much for a wonderful talk. And somebody else is saying, I've heard that soy has negative health effects. Has there been any studies that show a causation?
Yeah, so there have been studies showing health benefits and there have been other studies showing negative health effects, right? The idea is that soy, because of its estrogenic-like effects, could have the same effects as estrogen, right? Potentially beneficial in terms of decreasing heart disease and osteoporosis, and potentially harmful in sort of increasing the risk of breast cancer and causing blood clots. The reality is, unless you're eating a truly, truly heroic amount of soy, it's probably not going to make much of a difference. So I wouldn't stress too much about it. Food research is very, very hard because for all the issues that we talked about and that I get into in the book, is like there's so many competing variables and factors that can throw it off. So I wouldn't purposefully go out and eat soy for its health benefits. But if you're using it as a meat substitute to eat less red meat, if you're using it because you enjoy it, I think as long as you're eating a reasonable amount, like a reasonable human being, that's not the most important factor that's going to influence your life. If you want to know what are the 5 most important things for your health, I'll tell you those right now, and I'll tell you that for free. Don't smoke, exercise regularly, maintain a healthy body weight, get a regular checkup so you can look for things like high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, and eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Honestly, if you do that, that's like the most important stuff for your health. Everything else is details. Those are sort of the really big ones that you have to care about.
Thank you. Doug Brown says, great talk. Thank you very much. Wendy asks if you have a podcast on COVID research.
I mean, we don't, the podcast that we do with my friend Jonathan Jarry, it's not purely about COVID. We do vary up the topics, but we have talked about COVID a lot because, you know, it happened. But we do a COVID update every once in a while. The problem is this, is that a lot of the COVID research is just not definitive, right? So to fill like a regular podcast on COVID, you would end up doing what I think brought down Dr. Oz. I mean, you know, Dr. Oz is not on TV anymore. When he started on his TV show was fairly reasonable, right? It was like, you know, general health tips and all that. And it was like, fine. I think what did him in, I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons to it, but the thing that probably did him in was that when you have to fill a 60-minute show on a regular basis or weekly, whatever it is, at the end of the day, you end up grasping for topics and you're like, well, let's just cover whatever we can. And I think that that's why he started doing all these vitamins and supplements, because he just to fill airtime. And so I worry that if we did a show just on COVID, we would be trying to fill out airtime with a lot of these non-definitive studies. Like people ask me, like, what's new in long COVID research? The answer is not much. Like I could literally spend an hour talking about all these topics, but it comes all these possible new developments. But at the end, it comes down to really not all that much. We know how to treat COVID, which is get vaccinated, improve indoor air quality, and make sure that when people get sick, they stay home so they don't infect others. It's just that we don't do that all that well. We know what we have to do. We're just not that great at implementing these mechanisms, especially the indoor air quality thing, which we've kind of just let fall by the wayside for, you know, sad and very unfortunate reasons.
Wow. Well, Dr. Chris Labos, you have given us a really stimulating talk, lots and lots to think about and to get our heads around. So thank you very much on behalf of Toronto Mensa for this opportunity that you have given us. And just as a sign of our appreciation, I'd like you to know that we will be sending you a small gift.
Oh, thank you. Is it a puppy? Is it a puppy?
You want a puppy?
If you could send me a puppy, that would be amazing.
Well,
Because
I'll take
puppies
the
are
cat
awesome.
back.
You know, the only flaw that dogs have is that they don't live forever.
Okay.
Sorry, if I can, I don't know if I can, I don't know if you can see it, but right at the top of my screen above the books, you can see the feet of a stuffed animal. I was giving a talk to the Montreal Association of the Blind, and I said, do you want like a speaking fee? And I was like, just give me a puppy and we'll call it even. And so they got me that as a joke. And they're like, here, you said you wanted a puppy. And I was like, well played. Well played.
Well played. It fits your sense of humor.
It fits my sense of humor.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah.
This was great. And thank you very much to the audience. Thank you for all the people who put in questions and comments. It's been quite a nice afternoon altogether. So we'll say goodbye now.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.